Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is not only wrapped in a pandemic and overheating because of greenhouse gases accumulating in the atmosphere, it's overheating geopolitically. So, geophysically and geopolitically, we're facing simultaneous novel risks that don't come around very often. And the climate change one has been with us now for a couple of generations. And my guests today have been involved in looking at the atmosphere and the climate system through most of those decades, along with me. Paul Ehrlich and Anne Ehrlich from Stanford University are likely to join us, and others. But the issue on the floor today is nuclear peril. For those like me who grew up mainly in the 20th century, we spent our childhoods doing I think it was Six Bells in Rhode Island, my elementary school. I remember Six Bells being the go to the basement drill. I don't know about you guys, but and then there was a separate number of bells. It was fire drill. So it was part of the norm of coming of age was this perilous question. And here's Anne Ehrlich. Hello, Anne.
Hi.
I'm going to move you up here so we can see you better. Hold on one second. There. And now we have brewing this other extraordinary moment with Vladimir Putin going to war against a neighboring country, Ukraine, which he claims as his own. And 1 million people have already been displaced. Thousands are clearly dead. Travesty and a tragedy that this is playing out the way it is. This is just a few hours ago. This is the Kiev Independent. I hope you're following the Kiev Independent and supporting them. Is a newspaper, an online news site that has become a very valuable reference point for what's going on over there. And again, this is just fresh video from another hit on a non-military target. It's just an extraordinary, brutal invasion. And Mr. Putin has made statements that are clearly threatening to take this to yet another level. He hasn't expressly said it, but in many ways he has said something would happen that no one has experienced in their history. And it's hard to interpret that as other than nuclear. And we're going to talk about that from the vantage point of scientists who have looked at this kind of global risk, the interface between human activity of the destructive kind and what it can do to the atmosphere and climate. And today we have Alan Robock and Brian Toon. Alan's at Rutgers. Brian is at the University of Colorado still, I believe, right?
That's correct.
And Anne and Paul Ehrlich, luminaries at Stanford who for more than a half century, have been on the case, not just in terms of nuclear winter and population in peril, but also arms control and the like. So they'll be back on screen in a minute too. I thought we'd start with. I see Paul there. Oh, Paul is in the. I see.
Yeah, Paul, I don't know whether Anne can get sound.
Yep, Anne's there. Anne's got sound.
I can hear you.
I didn't realize you were coming in different rooms or different.
Well, we were together, and then we couldn't get the thing working right, so I came to my room. But that's all right.
No, it's great to see you all. And
I haven't seen Brian for about 40 years, I think. This is deja vu. We started writing about this in 1968. And I would never have believed that we would have lasted this long, and then it would come up this way.
So let's start there. Maybe we'll get back to that point when Paul and Anne. What was your first time you thought about this sort of war as an environmental phenomenon?
When we started reading about the firestorms in the Second World War, which were really impressive. And as soon as you saw what a nuclear weapon could do, it was obvious that you could burn down much of the world with it. As a matter of fact, I think in the population bomb, we assumed there was a scenario in which they assumed they'd use airbursts to actually start fires over large areas. Good grief, yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah, I remember hearing that the idea of the fires in Tokyo and in Dresden and the like had to catch someone's attention. Anyone who was thinking about aerosols and smoke and had to be thinking about this in a broader context besides the horror of the actual destruction.
well, it was also obviously, I mean, to go back some one night many years ago, John Holder and I got drunk, and I think the numbers would still hold up. How many Hiroshima-sized bombs would it take to end the United States or Russia as functional entities? And we came up with 12, I think it was, for the United States, and somewhat fewer for the then Soviet Union, because all you hit New York and Washington, and the government's gone and the financial system is gone, and then all you got to do is bring down the web, hit some of the main transport areas. If you don't have the net, the electric grid, and if you don't have electricity, you can't pump gas, and if you can't pump gas, most people in the country starve to death. And it turned out that Russia, as I recall, we had even fewer nubs. I mean, all of us have been involved since then in trying to convince people of how insane, mad and nuts. It really, both are really mad and nuts.
Yeah.
But that's just the direct effects of these weapons. The rest of the world would suffer from the climate effects.
Oh yeah.
Right. Well, let's go down the chain here a little bit. Anne, same from you. What was your early impression of whether was this something that you felt was underappreciated? This aspect of war?
Oh yeah, I would think so. Yes. People thought about buildings being destroyed and all the rest of that, but not much after that. The fact that it would have effects on food production and other important activities was pretty much lost.
And Brian, can you describe your first, how you came to focus on this question from just general atmospheric science and the like?
Well, at the time, I was in the early 1980s working on the effects of volcanoes and climate and supersonic transports and things like that. And then the Alvarez group at Berkeley discovered an asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. And so that led to the thought that there was small particles in the atmosphere that caused that extinction, which for now is pretty surely caused by the asteroid setting fire to all the forests on the surface of the Earth, and the smoke from that getting into the stratosphere and blocking sunlight, causing the temperatures to drop and stopping photosynthesis. Anyway, so we started looking into nuclear wars, and we quickly found that the same thing could happen there. That start burning cities, and nuclear weapons are made to destroy cities. They're not made to destroy tiny little military installation or something like that. They're city killers. That's what they do.
Right.
And one Trident missile carrying submarine has about 1,000 times the explosive power of the Hiroshima bomb. The Hiroshima bomb killed 100,000 people. So one Trident missile submarine could probably kill 100 million people just from the direct effects. But the smoke from burning cities could kill billions of people. We've written about this, Ellen and I and our colleagues,
right,
endlessly in the last few years. No one's paid much attention to it. But hopefully the current situation will wake the world back up that they've got a big problem here with these nuclear weapons, and they have to do something to control them, get rid of them, and not allow people to start threatening other people with them, which is actually there's an agreement previously in Ukraine is in other places that people would not threaten each other to use nuclear weapons.
Right. And Alan, just a quick sort of intro to how you got into this too. So far we have Dresden and dinosaurs essentially pulling people into this question.
Well, I was working on the climatic effects of volcanic eruptions too, like Brian, and I went to an AGU meeting, American Geophysical Union meeting 40 years ago. There was a talk on the climatic effects of nuclear war. And I went up to the door, and the meeting had been canceled because it was Brian's group, and their director at NASA told them NASA can't work on nuclear war. It will hurt our funding. But I got really interested in it and found out about it and did some simple calculations with the same climate model I used for volcanic eruptions, and verified the nuclear winter and that it would last for a long time.
Right. And that, right. This is kind of getting back to that. Let me just bring that slide up again because it's relevant. The point I came in was in 1984. That initial press conference and everything was the end of that year, to the December 1983.
Right.
And I wrote this story. I started digging in on. It was my first climate story. It was on the big chill, not the big heat up. And I still have a physical copy. I think you guys have seen this here, and it has most of you in it. Although I guess I don't know that Paul and Anne, you're not in here. And at that time, but that was the height of the Cold War. We had Reagan. 1983 November was when that the day after was shown on ABC TV. It had apparently the biggest audience, or one of the biggest audiences in the history of TV, and it showed the consequences of a nuclear war. And apparently, it stimulated even Ronald Reagan, according to his diary, to although it brought him into pushing forward on the Star Wars missile defense idea more than stopping the production of nuclear weapons as well.
Well, that was
a big moment.
There was a Russian team, Alexander Openstenchikov, who also did this calculation and got the same result. There would be a nuclear winter if the U.S. and Russia fought a nuclear war. And Reagan and Gorbachev got that information, and they decided that, yes, we can't fight a nuclear war. They accepted nuclear winter, that it was not propaganda, and ended the nuclear arms race. And so I felt very powerful that we had actually informed policy, and they'd taken a step to end the arms race.
Yeah.
The number of weapons is going down now, but we still have about 10,000 deployed. And so we can still produce a nuclear winter today.
Right, which is this whole body of work that you have on this website. And people can find it on that revkin.bulletin.com story that I did to set up this show today. I think, again, even journalists kind of went to sleep after a certain point of this. I wrote about Steve Schneider and Starley Thompson's foreign policy or foreign affairs commentary saying, well, it's more like nuclear autumn. And, nuclear autumn just doesn't have the same punch as nuclear winter.
No.
But you're saying this still is a big deal. And there's been more recent work as well. Can you just describe the recent work?
Well, so 15 years ago, I ran into Brian and Richard Turco at the AGU meeting, and they had calculated how much smoke might result from a war between two of these new nuclear nations, India and Pakistan, with 5 million tons of smoke. And they asked me to calculate the climate response. And it wouldn't be nuclear winter. Temperatures wouldn't get below freezing, but it would still be a huge climate change, unprecedented in recorded human history. And we calculated the impacts on agriculture. And we tried to get funding to continue this work. And it wasn't until 5 years ago, the Open Philanthropy Project gave us a grant, and we've been working on it and really amplifying this work ever since, and using modern climate models, which exactly reproduce what we found in the 1980s and in the 2000s. And so we're now trying to narrow down what country, the food availability in each country for different scenarios of smaller amounts of smoke and the amount of smoke that would be produced by a U.S.-Russia war.
That must be the most ignored classic paper in the history of science. It was 2007, I think, when it was finally published.
Right.
But, one of the things Anne and I have done continually, when we list the existential threats to humanity, we always say the one that's closest now, the one that could really change everything immediately, is, say, a war between India and Pakistan, where you have many people who would like to have it, God forbid.
And we used to think that along the Kashmir border was the most likely place for a nuclear war to start. Now, unfortunately, there are other places in the world that we have to worry about.
Yeah. And this, I think, again, the piece I wrote and the reporting I did the last couple of days, Putin has made these signals. as most everybody has said, this is still highly unlikely, but they always include the but. It's not zero. And when you add that with what your research has all found on the idea that even a quote unquote limited nuclear exchange there you go. Here's Mike Mills' animation of the elevation of soot.
Yeah, the black part is in the stratosphere above where we live, and so there's no rain to wash it out, and it would last for years and cover the world.
Right, and that seems, again, underappreciated. That's what distinguishes this from. Tell us why this is different than a volcano. You've done a lot of work on volcanoes too.
Volcanoes put sulfur in the stratosphere, and it forms these clear droplets of sulfuric acid, which come out after a couple years, and they don't absorb much sunlight. And so they have an effect, but they don't last as long. The smoke is heated by the sun and lofted high up into the stratosphere, where it can last for many years. And we've had some big forest fires recently in Australia and in Canada that do that. They put smoke into the atmosphere, into the stratosphere. We observed it being heated by the sun and lofted. And the same climate models we use to simulate that are the ones we're using for much more smoke. So that just validates our work much more. Brian's been working really hard on that part of it.
Yeah, Brian, can you weigh in?
Well, I'd like to go back to the Starley Thompson and Steve Schneider paper for a second.
Sure.
At that time, climate models and computers were so primitive, not even up to the level of an iPhone, that you could hardly do a calculation. So the top of Schneider and Thompson's model is at about 20 kilometers. And if you look at this picture you're showing right now, you can see the bottom of the smoke cloud in a modern model is at 20 kilometers. And they could only afford to run their model to simulate about 20 days. I don't know if you've noticed this, but the first 20 days of fall is not too bad. But if you keep simulating along, pretty soon it starts snowing on you. And agriculture ends in the fall every year. So this whole thing of nuclear fall is nothing but a ploy for emergence of doubt, as Naomi Oreskes described. This is an untrue simulation that was never adequate, even at that time, and which has been totally disproven by new modern simulations, such as the one that Mike did and Alan did, and
right.
The people have done in Europe. We've done this with multiple climate models now, and nuclear winter is much worse now in these simulations than we thought before, because the smoke rises so high. It lasts much longer than we had previously thought. But even back in the 1980s, at the time of the nuclear fall, it was still a nuclear winter. They just couldn't do the calculation long enough to see the temperature drop. And,
part of the problem is what they called nuclear fall. They took it global average temperatures, which include the oceans, which don't cool very much. But the middle of continents quickly have temperatures that go below freezing. It just happens that's where we grow our food.
Interesting. Well, I hope that maybe this conversation can serve as a little bit of a wake-up call for everyone, that these are profoundly important questions that are not just questions, but answers.
Well, let me point out that it's not like we have a wonderfully well-fed world now and that there's no threats to the food supply without adding further disruption of the atmosphere. I mean, the threat basically is to the end of civilization. Whether or not Homo sapiens would go extinct is something we've argued about, and it depends on so many factors you can't really predict anything, although most of the scientists I know who look at the whole picture think it's something you cannot write off. In other words, but the end of civilization is something that all of my biological colleagues and I think most physicists would agree that that's what's going to be if we have a nuclear war. I mean, you look at the social effects and so on. I mean, the person who ought to be on this show is some psychologist who really understands Putin and knows something about the people close to him and what capability they might have to stop him if he decides that his big mistake can only be solved by suicide, essentially.
Yeah, these questions are being played out in scenario exercises. I'm sure I just did a session a week ago, last Friday, with folks who were former Defense Department official and a former intelligence official. And unfortunately, the situation there is, it's really hard to see unless there is an internal tipping within Russia because of those oligarchs and everyone, feeling they're in peril, that they would somehow flip in a way that can take Putin out of the position of power. We're kind of stuck in a very disturbing moment.
Well, we all remember that one Russian submariner allowed us to have this talk today. It all could have gone during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Vasily Arkhipov.
Interesting.
That's
Tell that story, actually. Remind us.
There was what I remember of it was that there was a system in the Russian submarines which had nuclear torpedoes at the time that 2 or 3 officers had to agree that the launch code was proper. And it was in a submarine, I believe, where there was just 2 who had to agree. Mm-hmm. And one of them just said no. And if he hadn't said no, a nuclear missile would have been launched at one of the U.S. carriers. Right. And, I often think in the Ukraine situation, when you see what we did over Cuba, what would we do if the Russians were trying to get Mexico on their side? Remember in the First World War, there was the famous telegram, the German telegram to Mexico that actually almost basically got us into the First World War. So Putin may be crazy, but we certainly have been poking the bear in the eye with a pointed stick, as John Holdren says.
Right.
It was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a Soviet submarine off the coast of Florida, and American ships were dropping depth charges on it, not to sink it, but to just try to get it to come to the surface. And they were panicking. It was getting really hot in there, and the commander wanted to launch one of the nuclear torpedoes. It's sort of it's a myth that only the leader of the country can authorize the use of nuclear weapons, even today. They had the authority to actually use them. If I think it was 3 officers agreed, and Arkhipov said no.
But I think what this points to what the real issue here is, and that is when you go to a high alert situation, you just expose yourself to the possibility of a hacker or some mistake being made, and the whole thing gets out of control. And I think we have to think about the future here. I mean, in my mind, Russia is a failed state. Korea, it's unlike the rest of the European world and the free world. It hasn't developed a robust economy. It's totally developed. It's totally dependent on fuel oil and natural gas and other things that are being banned by the world because of the climate problem. And it's doing nothing to develop its economy. It's developing its military, just like North Korea. This is a recipe for a disaster in future decades. Russia will continue to be a problem over and over again until it starts to develop its economy and back away from just using its military and becoming a normal country like other European countries. So in my mind, the best thing that can come out of the Ukraine war, if anything good can come out of it, is we renegotiate treaties to limit nuclear weapons and try to get them down to much lower levels and stop the development. What they're doing now is developing all these systems that have very short warning times, are like drone submarines sitting in harbors waiting to blow up, or cruise missiles constantly in the atmosphere with nuclear weapons floating along waiting to attack, or gliders that are going to give you a few minutes of warning. Those are going to push us into artificial intelligence, trying to determine whether we need to respond to an attack. And this is just where mistakes have been made in the past. Most of the previous warnings or near catastrophes have occurred when a new detection system goes into place, it doesn't work right, and people think there's an attack. If we go to artificial intelligence to control these weapons, we're going to have some computer glitch decide to have a nuclear war for us. We have to
Right.
stop this madness.
Oh, but computers never make mistakes. You know that, Brian.
Right.
Exactly. That's why we couldn't get onto this web page easily this morning.
Right.
I just got screwed over by a web page before I came on.
Yeah. So there's a question here, which was alluded to a little earlier, but Kel Fran over on YouTube asks, how many nuclear bombs would need to be launched to bring about mass starvation, nuclear winter?
A few hundred.
I think that's way, way too high. It depends on how they're targeted.
Yeah,
If you knock down the electrical system and you can't pump gas, then in the U.S. or in Russia, most people will end up starving to death. The system is not built for that kind of resilience. And putting it back together, I mean, people in the U.S. government have been very much aware of these issues. And some of our presidents have been briefed on them, but we're sure not doing a lot about them. But I mean, the basic point, and I think somebody said it here already, is there's absolutely no reason to have nuclear weapons on a hair trigger of any kind. There's no reason to have them, period, because there's nothing sensible you can do with them. But to put them on a hair trigger, there's no way the U.S. could destroy the ability of Russia to wreck the U.S. or vice versa. One nuclear submarine on either side could do the job very nicely.
I think what Kel is asking about the rest of the world, not the places that would be targeted, and from the smoke from the fires that would be started by these nuclear weapons. And as Brian said, a few hundred if targeted on industrial areas and cities, which are targeted now, that would produce enough smoke to cause massive climate change and starvation. We're writing a paper right now called Global Famine After Nuclear War, and we're actually calculating that for every country for different scenarios, and that'll be out soon, I hope.
They're also, I'm sure you're looking at the various trade issues, because the way we've designed the world, if trade is disrupted, even if the conditions are not such to destroy agriculture in most places, it's
Well, this gets
our scenario is no trade because people would hoard just like they did with toilet paper.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, but no trade is a big factor there.
And there's only a few places in the world that massively overproduce and don't have that many people, like New Zealand and Australia and maybe Argentina, which would, if they stopped exporting, would probably do better. And they aren't at such a high latitude that there would be as much climate change. But that's only a few places in the world.
This is reminding me a little bit about one of the fairly new areas of study around global warming, which is compound risk, where you have multiple areas of the world that could enter water insecure conditions, sort of breadbasket areas simultaneously. And anyway, it feels like it's related too.
But as Paul said, you can't really use nuclear weapons. Why would you ever? How would it ever make sense to use nuclear weapons? If you really think violence is the way to solve your problems, we have precision-guided missiles we can use that aren't massive killers of everybody in this huge area. You may have heard about this mother of all bombs a couple of years ago that was dropped in Iraq. It was 10 tons of TNT, 10,000 pounds of TNT, or 20,000 pounds. The smallest nuclear weapon is 1,000 times bigger than that. The one dropped on Hiroshima was more than 1,000 times bigger than that. So it would massively obliterate people and everything for a large area. And so when would it ever make sense to use that, even if you thought you needed to use violence? And there's only 9 countries that have nuclear weapons. What about all the others that could have had them and chose not to have them and feel safer without them?
Well, Ukraine gave their nuclear weapons away, basically. Remember?
Yeah, it wasn't
the
really
original deal.
It wasn't really theirs, though.
No, but I meant they agreed to have the nuclear weapons taken away.
Right.
And now they're a little sorry. Yeah.
Maybe we'll play the game for a moment. That are we overly worried here? Is there really a credible scenario where Putin would push a button that could get to this point?
The Nobel Peace Prize was given to ICANN in 2017 for writing a treaty to ban nuclear weapons, and almost 60 countries have signed it already. And when Finn accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, She said, we're worried about crazy people that might push a button. And at the time, Trump and Kim were arguing about whose button was bigger. And so there may be crazy people in charge of it. That's the problem.
There's a question that's come in from John Sheehan here. Do Russia still have the Tsar bomb? We pressured Ukraine to give up their nukes.
Probably not. I mean, everybody has reduced the yields of their weapons because it's more efficient to have many small bombs if you want to blow things up, big bombs. And the Tsar bomb was gigantic, heavy thing. This really wasn't a very practical weapon.
Well, let's spend one moment just cheering what you've described, Alan, a little bit, which is that we did walk away from a much more perilous situation. I live right across the Hudson River from West Point, and West Point has this remarkable little museum, a museum of war, and they have among other things, they have a nuclear mortar. It was an atomic mortar. I can't imagine who thought that a mortar that would just be lobbing an atomic weapon at that range could have any possible rational use.
And it would kill the people that launched it too.
Yeah, I know. And one hopes that there's some aspect of Putin that's thinking. The other thing about Ukraine, of course, is they have 15 operating nuclear power plants, not just Chernobyl, and you're waging war there just among those plants. One would think you wouldn't want to create a new Chernobyl no-go zone in some place that you want to occupy too.
You don't want to cut off the power supply to those those nuclear plants, because then you'll have a Japanese situation where you can't control the cooling in the system. So it's very dangerous to start blowing things up around power plants.
That would be horrific locally because of the radioactivity, but it wouldn't be as horrible as a nuclear winter where the smoke would cover the world and affect places far removed from where any bombs would drop.
Just one last visual. This was a U.S. Test range, a cannon-fired atomic weapon from back in the day. Pretty amazing to think that.
It was a 15 kiloton weapon, I think, about the size of the Hiroshima one.
Yeah, just astounding. Well, I'm happy that we're not in a world where that prospect is still there.
One of the main problems is that people have just gone and decided that this is not a threat because we haven't seen anything until now that really raised the issue at the level that most will understand it. The rest of us have been scared for a long time. I can remember having nightmares right after Hiroshima, when I was living in the suburbs of New York, and there was a very loud thunderclap, and I thought it was an A-bomb going off over New York. You youngsters don't know this, but people were really scared of atomic bombs in those days. And we've just seen it buried, basically, and not paid the kind of attention we need to. And I think it's something all of us have to get even more strong about. That when we're talking, particularly people in my business, when we're talking about global toxification and loss of biodiversity, climate disruption on agriculture, all of them tying together and so on, we always should mention that as long as we got these goddamn weapons stored away, we have the potential for destroying civilization. And I think most of the estimates are too optimistic when you see, for example, if people are willing to riot over wearing masks, I'm a little nervous about what the reaction would be, even to a small number of weapons, what the demands would be, what some of the people in our Congress, I can't remember, Marjorie something Green, having her hands anywhere near even a pellet gun would scare the pants off of me.
Okay.
Did someone else have something to say?
What Anne should tell you about her experience with Margaret Thatcher when she was doing the Glowers study for London. I mean, a good example of suppressing the news for political.
Oh, the Home Office was against everything we were doing, but we had been commissioned by the City of London, or the London Council, to produce a study of what would happen if London experienced a nuclear war, which we did, and produced, I think it was 5 scenarios, ranging from one that didn't damage London at all to all out, and then built on that, what would be the results? How would people react? And what would it do to the economy? What would it do to the food system? What would it do to the natural environment in Britain? And that was what we were studying, and we did. We produced it. And in virtually Maggie's last act, she suppressed it as much as she could.
Wow.
I'm not sure who they sent it out to, and I know it was a fairly limited printing.
So it didn't really.
And it was a very interesting study.
If Putin is threatening to use nuclear weapons, even indirectly, if Russia attacked the United States with nuclear weapons and the United States did nothing, everybody in Russia would die from the climatic effects. They would starve to death. So this would be the action of a suicide bomber. People keep their nuclear weapons to say, I want to use them as a deterrent. But if you believe that you have to believe that they would be willing to kill themselves if they use them, because they would die from the effects. Brian and I wrote an article about this several years ago called Self-Assured Destruction. It's not mutual assured destruction. It's sad. It's not mad. You would, if you ever use them. And so why do we have thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons? Why do the US and Russia have them? The other nuclear countries have a couple hundred. They think that's enough to put one on the capital of your enemy to deter them, if they think that. And we're telling Iran not to have nuclear weapons, but we want to keep ours. It's like you're sitting in a bar telling people not to drink. Why would they even listen to us?
Well, of course, you know why we have them. Just follow the money. I mean, we've now lost, 4 wars in a row, and both parties went along with increasing our military budget. No small part of it goes to modernizing the triad and crap like that. I mean, it is financial. There's no... people would rather risk blowing up the world.
Yeah, the military-industrial complex. And, we're a few college professors. How can we fight against the army of lobbyists they have going and the money they give to congressmen to keep the money coming in? It's very frustrating.
Yeah, and you see this reaction at a time like this, too. Even you can see it in the energy sphere as well. The first people to dive in when the natural gas angle of the Ukraine problem was in the headlines were the American Petroleum Institute saying this just demonstrates we have to extract more oil and gas so we can help to fill the void.
Yes.
Other people say we have to stop using fossil fuels, and then they won't make any money, which we have to do anyway to stop global warming.
Yeah. Come on, fusion energy will be here in just 30 years. It's been here in just 30 years for the last 70, right?
It always will be, yeah.
Well, there are some new headlines that it might be a little quicker than they thought, but it's still such a tough
topic. A lot of people in Europe think that if there's a war, it's a U.S.-Russia war, but that's a total fallacy, because Russia has about 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons. Some of them are things like depth charges, but a lot of them could be just as powerful bombs as their strategic weapons. 2,000 of them. I just put together a list of military targets in Russia, the US, and Europe. And there's at least 600 targets in Europe, because Belgium, Germany, Italy, Britain, France, and Turkey all have nuclear weapons in their countries. In addition to that, there's all sorts of other military facilities there with tanks and other things that the Russians would want to attack. And then there's other things you would attack, like oil refineries and power plants and industrial facilities that support military. So there's thousands of nuclear weapons not controlled by treaties, whose yields are unknown, that the Russians could put onto aircraft, cruise missiles, and they have a lot of short-range missiles that all can carry these nuclear weapons. So in addition to the 8,000 weapons that are under treaties, there's thousands more that are not under treaties in Russia. Plus, there's another 1,000 that are not under treaties in Britain, France, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. So there's a whole bunch of weapons that are totally uncontrolled in the world, and no one knows much about them. Hopefully this Ukrainian situation will reawaken people to demand that politicians do something about controlling all these weapons. And we're in an age where Iran is probably going to start developing a nuclear weapon pretty soon, or have one pretty soon. That will either trigger a nuclear attack by Israel on Iran, or it will encourage Egypt and Saudi Arabia to get nuclear arsenals. We'll have a whole nuclear tete-a-tete going on in the Middle East with multiple nuclear weapon states there. And between that and the development of all these horrific weapons like cruise missiles and other things, we have to get control of this situation. Politicians have to do something about this instead of just ignoring it and throwing money at it.
We might be able to recruit more of the military into this. One of the cheery things when we were doing the nuclear winter studies and interacting all the time with field grade officers, at least, they all, on the basis of military ethics, did not like nuclear weapons at all. And Anne and I remember one of them saying to us in a meeting that you got to remember the towns in Germany are only 1 kiloton apart. And what you say is absolutely true, and most people are totally, totally ignorant of it. But the military, probably all of you know some people in the military who would join this conversation without disagreeing with anything that's been said.
For sure. There is an undercurrent at the Pentagon. It's, again, an undercurrent toward redefining national security so that it includes risk mitigation, focusing more on, it's the whole thing that I see all the time in disaster mitigation, where we spend all of our budgets fighting fires instead of helping communities build more wildfire safe designs. And this feels like it's a very similar, it's always an undercurrent, not an overcurrent.
We're not a species that evolved well to do long-term planning, and we don't do it. Prevention is nowhere near as sexy as fighting it when it occurs.
Yeah. Hold on a second. Speak among yourselves. I'm going to bring a book over here.
This is a fire you couldn't put out either. It's orders of magnitude. It's thousands of times bigger than any horrible forest fire.
Yeah.
The forest fires are bad enough.
If you read the details, by the way, just on what happened in cities in firestorms,
that's your book.
Oh, dear me.
The dominant animal.
That's the best book ever. Is that the Bible? Yeah.
It's better than the Population Bomb, actually.
Population Bomb was written Anne wrote it mostly in one evening.
Wow.
2 evenings.
No. Paul wrote it over a weekend with a little help from me.
Amazing. Well, let's talk. Let's spend the last 10 or 15 minutes here going wider. We talked about the Pentagon getting the conversation. There's a lot of young people out there who right now are getting feeling. You hear about climate grief, and they're facing the pandemic, sort of this long tail of the pandemic, and now here's Putin messing things up more, and drawing on this is for Anne and Paul particularly, because you're the elders among us even here.
We're just middle aged.
Yeah. Oh, good. I hope so, because that means we're all still have a long way to go. But, what's your message to young people right now as they grapple with the world with these multiple layers of complexity and stress?
Well, Anne is better at those messages. You tell them what to tell them, honey.
I would tell them to keep raising the issues and keep fighting.
Yeah, they're the only hope that I can see. Whenever I see that young lady
The emperor is real close.
Yeah, what's her name? Thunberg.
Mm-hmm.
She does more good One of the things I'm convinced of, and this is a sad thing to say to this group, maybe not to Andy, is I think all the action is in the social sciences. The scientific community knows what the problems are. We know in great detail what the hell can happen. Anne and I started around the turn of the century, a thing called we called it the Millennium Assessment of Human Behavior. The problem is we understand what's going on, but we won't do anything about it. And the issue is, why don't we do anything about it? And climate's a beautiful example of where the politics, we started out with pretty good climate science. I mean, every reasonable scientist understood if you put a lot of crap into the atmosphere, whatever it was, you're going to change the climate. And then it became a political issue. Then it became, Naomi Oreskes wrote a book I think everybody here is familiar with called Sellers of Doubt, or
Merchants of Doubt. Yeah.
Merchants of Doubt.
It's all about the money. It's all about the money again, with fossil
Yeah.
fuels as well as the military.
Yeah. And I hate to tell you, the universities are, in my view, even worse off. There isn't my friend Don Kennedy died, Anne and my friend. If he had been president of Stanford during this pandemic, he would have been out there on the scientific issues every day. There isn't the prominent intellectual scientists leading universities that there was 20 or 30 years ago. I'm having a big fight with Naomi over Harvard and Stanford. We were having a discussion the other day, and we were talking about wokeism, but she got into how really conservative and stupid Harvard is, which insulted me because I had to point out that Stanford was more conservative and stupid than Harvard. And I thought I killed her by pointing out we had produced Josh Hawley. But she came back immediately with Ted Cruz. And, we're in this war now of which university produces more stupid people.
This idea. Yeah, I wrote a long story in 2016 that was basically a mea culpa about my from 1988 through 2006. So my first 18 years writing about climate change. I don't think I interviewed one social scientist through that whole stretch. It took me until 2006 I interviewed Helen Ingram at the University of California, Irvine, for a story when Al Gore's movie came out and everyone was yelling and screaming. And she told me these things that were perhaps not as firm as Newtonian, laws of physics, but really, really firmly understood. And she said, people vote on things that are soon, salient, and certain. And, global warming, a lot of these other issues are not like that. They're complex, they're sprawling. And I started to realize, the more I talked to people like her, that the issues here are not just simple matter of convincing someone based on facts. And it was a profound transition for me. It was a hard one. And I think a lot of scientists feel the same way sometimes.
In the 1980s, there were a lot of marches. People were really afraid about nuclear war, and there were a lot of demonstrations, and the people were speaking out, and that, along with the scientific message about nuclear winter, helped to end the arms race. Right now, people don't march about this. They march about things, like you said, things that are closer to them. They worry about how much gas is going to cost. They worry about their children, their jobs, masks, the pandemic. And so how can we get this to the top of their level of concern to tell the policymakers, at least in democracies where we live, to do something about it?
Yeah, and I guess you've all laid out pretty clearly that, unlike some of the other issues, nuclear peril is really fundamentally governmental. It's not something. There's nothing you as a citizen can really do other than lobby and demonstrate.
Well, you can turn in your nuclear weapons.
I'm going to get rid of my nuclear weapons. Yeah.
I mean, the NRA, I think, remember that Scalia, I think it was, raised the question in the Supreme Court of whether or not a surface-to-air missile was a protected arm because it was an arm you could bear, you could carry it. That was actually an issue. I mean, if you look at you don't have to go for violence all the way up to nuclear war. What could we possibly do to keep people from being shot every day in the United States in relatively large numbers? It's a terrible mystery. I mean,
I just want to bring it back to dinosaurs.
Yeah.
They didn't see it coming, but we know that such a catastrophe could be caused by us if nuclear weapons were used. And Brian gave a TED Talk, which I think has almost 6 million viewers now, about comparing dinosaurs to nuclear war. So I highly recommend that to everybody.
Could somebody, Brian, could you send it around the URL?
I think
so we can spread it.
I linked it in my story.
Andy, go back to that webpage and click on TED Talks.
Oh, right. It's down the bottom of here, isn't it? Yeah, there we go.
I think the surprising thing there is it had about 4 million views about a month ago.
So oh, really? So it's getting in behind you.
I looked at it in the last few days or weeks. It's quite interesting to go and look at all the comments there. The title of this talk, which I didn't give it, but somebody else did, it says, "I've studied nuclear wars for 35 years, and you should be worried." And so a lot of people commented, "Well, I've studied nuclear wars for the last 5 days, and I am worried."
Wow.
So it's very interesting. I don't know about you guys, but I'm deluged by people saying, "I live in Britain. I want to get out of here before the war starts. Where should I go? I live in New Zealand. Am I going to be poisoned by radioactive fallout? I live in Slovakia. Shall I move to Africa or South America?"
Wow.
People are worried about this.
That's interesting about the talk.
Putin is less and less appearing rational, and it's pretty scary.
Yeah. I'll just show a little bit of it here, just to kind of cut in and kind of midstream.
And it would rise to altitudes between 20 and 50 miles above the surface. At those altitudes, it never rains. The smoke would stay there for years. This farmer may be in Europe or in the United States, but many thousands of miles from Pakistan and India, is looking at the smoky sky above him and down at the crops that have died in his field from lack of light and cold temperatures. It's estimated that in a war between India and Pakistan, that we would lose 10 to 40% of the yields of corn, wheat, and rice for years afterward because of the bad weather. The entire world only has enough food to feed the population for 60 days unless agriculture produces more food. Ira Helfand, a member of the Nobel Peace Prize winning International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, has estimated that 1 to 2 billion people would die after a war between India and Pakistan of starvation. And after a full-scale nuclear war, temperatures would plunge below ice age conditions. We would be in a nuclear winter. No crops would grow. It's estimated that 90% of the population of the planet would starve to death, and civilization would be destroyed. And no one would be safe. Not those in countries with no nuclear weapons, not those in countries that didn't participate in the war, and not those on the other side of the planet from where the explosions occurred. No one would be safe. I bet you're not getting a warm and fuzzy feeling out of this talk.
Good line.
But we don't have to just keep plodding on like we have been, walking toward disaster. We can do things to stop a nuclear war and prevent global starvation and the end of human civilization. In the 1980s, politicians recognized the dangers of a nuclear conflict and did things about it. Nowadays, politicians don't seem to understand the dangers of these wars.
Well, have you ever been on the Daily, any of the shows? I know, Paul, we grew up in an era when you were on the Tonight Show. I don't know how many times.
Something over 20, I'm not sure.
20.
John and I got along very well. He was a good guy, you know. The networks and the so on did not want me or Carl Sagan or Steve Schneider on the Tonight Show. But John, it's the money. John was the most powerful person, certainly personality, in Hollywood. And one night, Ann and I had dinner with him and Joanna in one of the fancy restaurants, and every single celebrity that came in felt it necessary to come to our table and make obeisance to John. And he was basically a very shy guy, and also very smart. I never worked with anybody in the media easier than him, but he was, that era is gone. Hopefully some of you have watched the not so great but interesting movie called Don't Look Up.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, for somebody who's been involved in the media, it really came to me because of the part of it you recall is trying to get the message the planet is going to be destroyed through the news of who's getting divorced and who's got caught sexting or whatever. And it was very effective.
If you all have just another minute or two here, let me just see if I can hold on. I'm going to show this. I have to make sure I do it the right way. A little memory lane clip for Paul here. Hold on 1 second.
If Stephen Colbert is listening, I'd be happy to come on and talk about this.
I know. Well, we can see if we can work that out. So here is
that's what needs to be done.
This is 1977.
Yeah, turn the sound up, Andy.
Oh, the sound off?
You can hardly hear him.
Oh, okay. Hold on.
How do you find this stuff so fast? You're a good journalist.
You can't hear it.
You can't hear it. Oh, that's too bad. Well, you haven't changed that much.
Oh, thanks.
Oh, no, I think in a good way. In a good way. Let's see.
If you're a born loudmouth, there's nothing like going on a show like that, believe me.
Yeah. Well,
in terms of getting reaction.
Maybe we could see what we could do. I don't know any of the current crop of late night people, but here we are. We're at the end of this hour. There's a lot more to do for me before this day is out. And it's just great to have you all here. These issues are really so vitally important, and I'll do what I can to just keep trying to get them back in the foreground as much as I can with my limited capacity. But you all help, because if you weren't here, I couldn't do what I do. So thank you.
Well, thank you for giving the exposure. Yeah. Thank all of you, by the way. I've made wonderful use of your work over time.
Yeah, and I think the animations and things, Mike Mills and others, Luke Oman, they work on those.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
They really do help.
Yeah.
Both Brian and Ellen, will you put me on your email, Anne and me on your email list, so we make sure we have the most recent stuff always?
Absolutely. I'll send you a link to this webpage. It has all our papers, links to the TED Talks. I gave one too 5 years ago. It hasn't had as many people watch it. And so, yes.
Yeah, okay. I will spread it everywhere I can.
Folks out there are thankful too. There was a good audience today, and everyone who's watching, you can share this video as soon as we're done with others, because it gets archived on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, and wherever video is streaming. This is Andy Revkin from the Columbia Climate School here from the Hudson Valley in Lenape territory. It's a beautiful day. There's a horrible situation in Ukraine still unfolding. Every day seems to show the worst possible side of humanity. Bill Bryson, great author, in a book long ago, once said humans are both divine and felonious. And I think we're seeing the felonious part in spades and the murderous part, and unfortunately, currently. But everyone on this broadcast, Anne Ehrlich, Paul Ehrlich, Alan Robock, Brian Toon, thanks to you for doing all the hard work you do and have done through the decades. And come back sometime, okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. Glad to.
Awesome.
Take care, Andy. Keep going.